struggling ranchers rescued two enormous Apache sisters. The following morning, their chief arrived with an astounding verdict. The tempest had subsided, but what Ezekiel Marsh discovered in his homestead challenged all reason. Two Apache women lay senseless beside his perishing livestock. Yet these weren't typical women. They were titans among their tribe, each rising taller than most men when standing. The smaller one still reached beyond 6 feet, her mighty build designed for battle and endurance. The larger one was colossal, nearly 7 feet of pure strength and sinew, her shoulders wider than any pioneer Ezekiel had encountered. Apache women of this stature were myths shared around campfires, warrior daughters of chiefs raised from infancy to battle like men, yet bearing the sacred duty of preserving bloodlines. They never journeyed unaccompanied. They never materialized at struggling homesteads without complete war bands trailing them. The massive women displayed elaborate beadwork, marking them as nobility, their ornaments worth more than Ezekiel's entire holdings. Crimson seeped through the smaller one's ripped garments, while the larger one's respiration came in strained gasps. Both had sustained grave wounds, escaping something or someone perilous enough to divide them from their guardians. Every instinct Ezekiel harbored screamed one reality: aiding Apache meant death for settlers like himself. That was the unyielding rule of this merciless wilderness. But when the enormous woman's gaze opened and met his, Ezekiel witnessed something that demolished every belief he'd maintained about Apache fighters. Not rage or loathing, but frantic human dread. The identical terror he'd experienced watching his ranch slowly perish, knowing he was helpless to prevent it. She attempted to speak, her tone deep and powerful despite her wounds, but managed only a murmur in her ancestral language before awareness vanished again. Standing above two collapsed giants who could destroy him with bare hands, Ezekiel understood that his actions in the coming moments would either brand him the greatest fool on the frontier or unveil strength he never realized he possessed. The choice that would transform everything came down to 3 minutes and 2 dying titans. Ezekiel knelt beside the unconscious Apache women, his hands shaking as he examined their injuries. Even prone, their size was intimidating. The shorter one's frame extended nearly 6.5 feet, her muscled limbs thicker than most men's legs. The taller one was a genuine giant, likely close to 7 feet tall, her broad shoulders spanning wider than Ezekiel's entrance. Both carried the lean muscle of trained fighters, their bodies built for combat and survival in harsh frontier environments. The shorter giant had received something sharp to her ribs, perhaps a branch, perhaps something worse. Dark blood stained the earth beneath her massive form, and her breathing wheezed with each exhalation. The taller one bore a wound across her brow, but her eyes remained vigilant, observing his every action with dangerous intensity that reminded him these women could break his neck effortlessly. His homestead sat 15 miles from the closest neighbor, 40 from town. Here, helping Apache meant signing his death certificate if other settlers learned of it. Men had been executed for less, accused of treachery, of choosing sides in a conflict that showed no compassion to either. The wounded giant's breathing grew more shallow. Ezekiel had witnessed enough dying cattle to recognize the symptoms. She had perhaps an hour, possibly less. "Please," the conscious giant whispered in fractured English. Her voice held a deep, authoritative tone that made clear she was used to being obeyed. "Help, sister." Ezekiel's throat constricted. The word sister struck him like a physical impact, summoning memories of his own sister, Elizabeth, lost to fever 3 winters prior. But observing these two massive women, he recognized they represented something far more dangerous than family loyalty. They were Apache royalty, warrior daughters, whose vanishing would bring entire war parties seeking answers. Thunder growled in the distance. Another storm was approaching rapidly, and 2 giants would die in his yard if he remained inactive. His neighbors would discover the bodies eventually, probably assume he'd killed them defending his property. That narrative would protect him, maybe even earn him respect in town. But as he stared into the conscious woman's face, high cheekbones weathered by wind, dark eyes that held no begging, only resigned acceptance, Ezekiel felt something fracture inside his chest. This wasn't about Apache or settlers. This was about 2 human beings bleeding out before him while he calculated the cost of his soul. "Damn it," he muttered, sliding his arms under the wounded giant's shoulders. She was impossibly heavy, solid muscle beneath torn fabric. Her unconscious body weighed more than a full-grown steer. The conscious giant struggled to her feet, wavering, but determined to help carry her sister. Her own imposing height made Ezekiel feel like a child beside her. Together, they maneuvered toward his cabin. Each step felt like walking toward a precipice. The wounded woman's weight nearly crushed him despite the healthy giant's assistance behind them. The wind intensified, bringing the scent of rain and something else. Dust clouds that might mean riders approaching from the southern ridge. As they reached his doorway, Ezekiel realized his cabin entrance was too narrow for the wounded giant's broad shoulders. They would have to turn her sideways, careful not to worsen her injuries. "They come," the conscious giant whispered, her grip tightening on her sister's legs as she looked toward the horizon. Soon, the riders appeared on the ridge like wolves hunting wounded prey. Ezekiel pressed his back against the cabin wall, peering through a gap in his shutters. 5 Apache warriors sat motionless on their horses, scanning the valley below. Even from this distance, he could see the war paint streaking their faces and the rifles slung across their backs. "Your sister," he whispered to the conscious woman who had introduced herself as Ayana. "What does she do? Why are they hunting you?" Ayana's jaw tightened as she pressed a torn cloth against her sister's wound. It spoke against marriage. The chief's son wanted her as a wife. She said no. The simplicity of it hit Ezekiel like a punch to the gut. A woman refusing marriage. And now both sisters were marked for death or capture. He thought of his own freedom to choose, to say no, to walk away from anything he didn't want. These women had no such luxury. Through the window, he watched the lead warrior raise his hand, pointing directly at Ezekiel's cabin. They had found the blood trail. "How many bullets do you have?" Ayana asked quietly, checking the knife on her belt with practiced efficiency. Ezekiel counted his ammunition, 12 rounds for his rifle, 6 for his pistol, against 5 experienced fighters who knew this terrain better than he ever would. "Not enough," he admitted. Idil's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy with fever. She spoke in rapid Apache to her sister, her voice urgent despite her weakness. Ayana's expression darkened with each word. "What did she say?" Ezekiel demanded. "The warriors are not here for us," Ayana said slowly. "They're here for you." The words made no sense. Ezekiel had never wronged the Apache, never stolen their land or killed their people. His ranch sat on territory purchased legally from the territorial government, though he knew that meant little to those who had lived here first. "Why me?" Ayana studied his face with those sharp dark eyes, as if measuring whether he could handle the truth. Outside, the warriors began their descent toward his cabin, moving with the deadly patience of experienced hunters. 3 moons ago, an Apache girl was found near death by the river. A white man brought her to our village, left her with medicine and food. He never gave his name, never asked for payment. She paused, watching recognition dawn in his eyes. You remember now? Ezekiel's breath caught. The girl by the creek, maybe 14 years old, half drowned and burning with fever. He'd found her while checking his water traps, stayed with her until she was strong enough to travel, then guided her toward Apache territory before riding away. He'd never told anyone, never expected gratitude or recognition. She was the chief's daughter, Ayanna continued. Chief Nailish swore a blood debt to the unnamed white man who saved her life. But some warriors say no debt is owed to settlers. They come to test the truth of her story. The sound of hoofbeats grew closer. Ezekiel realized with growing horror that this wasn't about the women he'd just sheltered. This was about a debt he never knew existed, a life he'd saved without understanding the consequences. Outside his door, the horses stopped. A voice called out in Apache, demanding and authoritative. Ayanna reached for his arm, her fingers strong and warm against his skin. What you do next, she said quietly, decides if you live as a friend or die as an enemy. The door shook under a heavy fist, and a voice called out in English, White man, we know you're inside. Come out now. Ezekiel's hands trembled as he gripped his rifle. Beside him, Ayanna helped her sister sit up against the wall, both women preparing for whatever violence might come. Idle was pale but alert, her dark eyes fixed on the door with grim determination. I'll go out, they might kill me, Ezekiel whispered. I stay inside, they'll burn us all out. No burn, Ayanna said firmly. They test your courage, not seek war. Another voice joined the first, younger and more aggressive. You help women who defy the chief's son. This makes you an enemy of the Apache people. Ezekiel recognized the trap. If he admitted to helping Ayanna and Idle, he sided against the chief's son. If he denied it, he lied to warriors who had already seen evidence of his actions. Either path led to death. But Ayanna's next words changed everything. Tell him the truth about River Girl. Tell him your name. She was asking him to claim the blood debt, to identify himself as the man who had saved the chief's daughter. It meant gambling his life on the word of a 14-year-old girl from a month ago, betting that her father valued honor above politics. The pounding grew more insistent. Through the window, Ezekiel saw two warriors moving toward his small barn where his horses were kept. They were running out of time. My name is Ezekiel Marsh, he called through the door, his voice carrying farther than he expected. 3 moons ago, I pulled Chief Nailish's daughter from the creek waters and brought her home safely. Silence fell outside. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. When the voice came again, it was different, older, more measured. Show yourself, Ezekiel Marsh. Bring the women. Ayanna nodded to him, then helped her sister to her feet. Idle swayed but stayed upright, her hand pressed against her bandaged ribs. Together, the 3 of them approached the door. Ezekiel lifted the wooden bar and pulled the door open. 5 Apache warriors sat on their horses in his yard, wore paint sharp across their faces. But now he could see something else in their expressions. Uncertainty, maybe even respect. The leader, a man with gray threading through his black hair, studied Ezekiel with intense curiosity. You are smaller than daughter described, the warrior said. She said white man was giant who fought river spirits. Despite everything, Ezekiel almost smiled. Children always made stories larger than life. I'm just a rancher. Found her caught in fallen branches. Helped her get free. The leader's gaze shifted to Ayanna and Idle. These women brought shame to Chief's son. Why do you help them? The question hung in the air like smoke. Ezekiel felt the weight of 3 lives balancing on his next words. Same reason I helped your chief's daughter, he said simply. Because they needed help. The gray-haired warrior studied him for a long moment, then turned his horse toward the others. They spoke in rapid Apache, their voices low but urgent. When they finished, the leader looked back at Ezekiel with something that might have been approval. Chief Nailish comes at sunrise, he announced. He will decide if blood debt covers women's defiance. You will wait. The longest night of Ezekiel's life stretched ahead like a death sentence waiting for dawn. After the warriors disappeared into the darkness, he helped Ayanna change her sister's bandages by lamplight. Idil's wound had stopped bleeding, but infection remained a real threat. The torn flesh along her ribs looked angry and swollen, though she never complained. Will he kill me? Ezekiel asked quietly, watching Ayanna work with practiced hands. Ayanna pressed against the window, her body tense as a drawn bowstring. 3 riders, not Apache. Her voice dropped to an urgent whisper. White men with badges. Ezekiel's stomach turned to ice. If settlers had discovered Apache women in his cabin, morning's confrontation with Chief Nailish would be the least of his worries. Outside, a familiar voice called through the night. Marsh, we know you're in there. Come out slow, hands where we can see them. Deputy Marshal William Kane stepped into the lamplight, his badge catching the glow like a warning. Behind him, 2 other lawmen spread out across Ezekiel's yard, their hands resting on their gun belts with practiced ease. Marsh, we got reports of Apache in this area, Kane announced, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. Tracking party says they headed this direction after attacking the Morrison place. Ezekiel's blood went cold. If the Morrison ranch had been hit, settlers would be screaming for Apache blood. Any Apache found would be shot on sight, no questions asked. Behind him, he sensed Ayanna's massive frame tensing in the doorway. Nearly 7 feet of trained warrior ready to fight if necessary. Even wounded, she was more dangerous than all 3 lawmen combined. Idil remained motionless against the wall, but her giant form coiled with barely contained power despite her injuries. Haven't seen any Apache, Ezekiel said, stepping outside and pulling the door closed behind him. His body felt small and inadequate, blocking the entrance, knowing that 2 women, each capable of crushing these men with their bare hands, waited inside. Kane studied him with suspicious eyes. That so? Because there's blood on your porch, Marsh. Fresh blood and a lot of it. He gestured to one of his men, who immediately began examining the dark stains in the dirt. Cut myself chopping wood. Ezekiel lied smoothly. Axe slipped on wet wood, caught my arm. Show me the cut, Kane demanded. Ezekiel's mind raced. He could fake an injury, maybe use his knife to create a fresh wound. But Kane was no fool. A federal marshal would spot the difference between old blood and new, between injury and fabrication. Deputy, called the man examining the bloodstains. This ain't from one person. Different patterns, different amounts. And these footprints, he pointed to impressions in the mud. These are huge, bigger than any settler I've seen. Kane's eyes narrowed as he studied the massive footprints that clearly belonged to the giant Apache sisters. What kind of people you been hosting here, Marsh? Don't know what you mean, Ezekiel replied, but sweat beaded on his forehead. Kane drew his pistol. Step away from that door. We're searching your place. You got a warrant? Ezekiel asked, though he knew it didn't matter out here. Federal marshals made their own law, especially when hunting Apache. Don't need one for Indian killers, Kane replied coldly. Stand aside. Ezekiel knew he had seconds before they discovered Ayanna and Idil. Once that happened, all 3 of them were dead. The giant women for being Apache, him for harboring enemies of the territory. But as Cain stepped toward the door, Ezekiel made a desperate decision. "Wait," he called out. "You're right. There are Apache here. 2 women badly injured. They came seeking help." Cain's gun swung toward him. "You admit to harboring hostiles?" "I admit to helping 2 dying human beings," Ezekiel said firmly. "Same as I'd do for anyone else." The marshal's face twisted with disgust. "Apache sympathizer. You'll hang for this, Marsh." Behind the door, Ezekiel heard movement. The giant sisters preparing for battle. But before anyone could act, one of Cain's men called out urgently from the ridge, "Marshal, riders approaching from the north. Too dark to see. How many?" Cain spun toward the sound, his weapon forgotten for the moment. In the distance, the sound of approaching horses grew steadily louder. "Could be more Apache," Cain muttered, then raised his voice to his men. "Defensive positions. We'll settle with Marsh after we see who's coming." As the lawmen scrambled for cover, Ezekiel realized that reinforcements were arriving. But whether they came as salvation or doom would depend entirely on who rode through the darkness toward his cabin. The sound of hoofbeats grew closer, carrying with it the weight of judgment that would arrive with the dawn. The riders that appeared in the darkness weren't Apache. They were more federal agents, reinforcements that Cain had called for backup. "Marshal Cain," the lead rider called out, dismounting quickly. "We've got orders from the territorial governor. All Apache harbored by settlers are to be brought in for questioning about the Morrison killings." Cain's confidence returned with the additional support. Now 6 armed lawmen surrounded Ezekiel's property, making resistance impossible. "Search every building," Cain ordered. "Bring out anyone you find." Ezekiel's heart pounded as he realized his confession had doomed them all. Within minutes, Ayanna and Idil would be discovered, and all 3 of them would be dead or imprisoned. But Ayanna surprised everyone by stepping out of the cabin voluntarily, her massive frame filling the doorway before she emerged into the lamplight. Even the hardened marshals stepped back involuntarily. None had ever seen an Apache woman of her size and bearing. She carried herself like royalty, her nearly 7-foot frame moving with deadly grace despite her injuries. "I am Ayanna, daughter of Chief Nailish," she announced in clear English. "This man saved my sister's life when she was dying. Apache law protects those who show mercy to our people." Idil followed her sister outside, her own imposing height and muscled frame making the marshals exchange nervous glances. These weren't ordinary Apache women. They were giants among their people, trained warriors who could kill with their bare hands. Cain raised his rifle toward the sisters. "Apache law doesn't mean anything to federal marshals. You're coming with us." "No," Ayanna said simply, her deep voice carrying absolute authority. "We are not." "You don't have a choice," Cain replied, but uncertainty crept into his voice. Something about these giant women's confidence suggested they knew something he didn't. Ayanna smiled, a cold expression that reminded Ezekiel of her father. "My father comes at sunrise. He will speak for us then. Until sunrise, we remain under the protection of the blood debt owed to this man." "What blood debt?" Cain demanded. Idil stepped forward, her massive frame casting shadows across the yard. 3 moons ago, a white rancher saved the chief's youngest daughter from drowning. Apache law says life debt must be honored. This man called in the debt tonight when he helped us." The marshals exchanged glances. They had heard of Apache blood debts, sacred obligations that even war parties honored. But they had never encountered a situation where a white settler could claim such protection. "That's Indian superstition," Cain said, but his voice lacked conviction. Federal law supersedes tribal customs. Does it? Ayanna asked quietly. Then explain why the territorial governor signed a treaty last winter recognizing Apache legal customs in matters involving tribal members. Kane's face went pale. The treaty was real, a political necessity to avoid all-out war. If these women were really Chief Nailish daughters, and if Ezekiel could prove he'd saved another daughter, then federal law would be forced to recognize the blood debt until the chief himself could rule on it. "We'll wait until morning," Kane finally said. "But if your father doesn't show, or if his decision doesn't satisfy federal requirements, all three of you are coming with us." As the marshals established a perimeter around the property, Ezekiel realized that everything now depended on what Chief Nailish would decide when he arrived with the sun. The giant sisters had bought them one night, but morning would bring judgment that could mean life or death for all of them. Ayanna moved closer to Ezekiel, her imposing presence both protective and comforting. "Father is a wise man," she said quietly, "but wisdom sometimes requires difficult choices." Looking at the armed men surrounding his property, Ezekiel understood that Chief Nailish's decision wouldn't just determine their fate. It would set a precedent for how Apache and federal law interacted on the frontier. As the long night wore on, all they could do was wait for sunrise and hope that wisdom would prove stronger than politics. When judgment finally came, dawn broke with the sound of approaching horses, exactly as Ayanna had promised. Ezekiel stood in his doorway, exhausted from a sleepless night spent watching federal marshals patrol his property. The giant sisters had maintained their vigil beside him, their imposing frames serving as both protection and a reminder of what was at stake. Marshal Kane emerged from behind his makeshift barricade, rifle ready as dust clouds appeared on the northern horizon. "That better be your chief," he called to Ayanna, "because if it's a war party, we'll start shooting." Ayanna straightened to her full, intimidating height, her nearly 7 feet of trained muscle casting a long shadow in the morning light. "My father comes as promised. He will speak Apache law and federal law both." The riders materialized from the dust, not the massive war party Kane had feared, but Chief Nailish with a carefully chosen group of 5 elders, their faces painted for a formal ceremony. They approached slowly, deliberately, every movement calculated to show respect for both Apache tradition and federal authority. Chief Nailish dismounted with the dignity of a man accustomed to command. He was older than Ezekiel had expected, maybe 50 winters, but his body carried the lean strength of a survivor. Most striking were his eyes, intelligent, calculating, and completely unintimidated by the armed marshals surrounding him. "Marshal Kane," the chief said in perfect English, somehow knowing the lawman's name, "you hold my daughters as prisoners. This creates a problem between our peoples." Kane stepped forward, his badge catching the morning sunlight. "Your daughters murdered settlers at the Morrison place. They're wanted for questioning under federal law. Morrison tried to force himself on my daughters." Chief Nailish replied with dangerous calm. "They defended their honor. Apache law justifies their actions. Federal treaty recognizes Apache law in matters involving tribal members." The legal chess match had begun. Ezekiel watched as 2 experienced negotiators circled each other with words instead of weapons, each seeking advantage through law rather than force. "Even if that's true," Kane said, "harboring fugitives is a federal crime. This rancher broke the law helping them." Chief Nailish turned his attention to Ezekiel, studying him with intense focus. "You are Ezekiel Marsh. 3 moons ago, you saved my youngest daughter from drowning in the creek." "Yes, sir," Ezekiel managed, feeling the weight of everyone's attention. For this, Apache law says I owe you blood debt. Life for life. The chief's voice carried across the yard with absolute authority. But you also saved 2 more of my daughters when they were dying. This makes the debt very complicated. Ayanna stepped closer to Ezekiel, her massive frame both protective and supportive. Chief, she said formally, this man risked everything to help us. He is worthy of Apache respect. Chief Nailish nodded slowly, then reached into his saddlebag and withdrew something that made everyone go still, a necklace of carved bone and silver, the kind worn only by Apache family members of the highest rank. 3 lives saved creates obligation beyond simple blood debt, the chief announced, his words carrying the weight of tribal law. Ezekiel Marsh, you have proven yourself worthy of adoption into Apache family. You become my son through deed and honor. Kane's rifle trembled in his hands. You can't just declare American territory as Indian land. The federal government recognizes treaty rights. Chief Nailish interrupted smoothly. Treaty says Apache can adopt members, claim family lands. Your own law protects adopted Apache family members from persecution. The brilliance of the decision struck Ezekiel like lightning. In one move, the chief had solved every problem. Protection for his daughters, legal immunity for Ezekiel, and a way to claim valuable ranch land under federal treaty law. Ezekiel Marsh, Chief Nailish continued. Do you accept adoption? Do you take my daughters as your sisters, my people as your people? Looking at Ayanna and Idil, 2 giant warriors who had trusted him with their lives, Ezekiel realized this was more than legal protection. It was transformation, belonging, and the chance to bridge 2 worlds that had only known war. I accept, he said clearly. Chief Nailish stepped forward and placed a necklace around Ezekiel's neck. The weight of it felt like chains and freedom combined. Kane holstered his weapon with obvious frustration, knowing he had been outmaneuvered completely. This isn't over. There will be federal investigations. Let them come, Chief Nailish said with quiet confidence. Apache law is clear. Federal treaty honors Apache law. My son and daughters are under tribal protection now. But as the chief prepared to leave with his elders, he turned back to Ezekiel with something that might have been amusement in his ancient eyes. Son, he said quietly, tomorrow I return with a different decision. Tonight, think carefully about what adoption truly means. The next day, Chief Nailish returned with a decision that would change everything forever. Ezekiel stood in his yard, still wearing the adoption necklace that had made him part of the Apache family, still uncertain about what the chief's cryptic words about a different decision had meant. Beside him, Ayanna towered in all her 7-foot glory, her massive frame casting shadows across the ground as she watched her father approach with a small group of elders. The months following his adoption had been a revelation. His failing ranch had transformed into a thriving trading post where Apache families came to exchange goods with white settlers under federal treaty protection. The Giant Sisters had proven invaluable. Idil's imposing presence and sharp mind for business made negotiations smooth and profitable, while Ayanna's incredible strength helped with construction and heavy labor that would have taken Ezekiel weeks to complete alone. But success came with complications he hadn't anticipated. Every day spent working alongside Ayanna, watching her move with deadly grace despite her towering size, feeling the quiet intelligence behind her dark eyes, had made his feelings for her impossible to ignore. She was his sister by Apache law now, protected by rules that carried death sentences for violation. You struggle with adoption, Ayanna had observed the day before, her own 6.5-foot frame making even ordinary conversations feel momentous. Apache law protects family, but some protections become prisons. Now, as Chief Nailish dismounted with ceremonial dignity, Ezekiel wondered if the older man had somehow sensed the impossible situation he'd created. "My son," the chief began, his voice carrying the weight of final judgment, "you have honored adoption well. Apache people see your worth, your protection of those who needed shelter." He paused, studying Ezekiel's expression. "But I am an old man, and old men sometimes solve one problem while creating another." Ezekiel felt his heart race as the chief's calculating gaze moved between him and Ayanna. "When I made you brother to my daughters," Chief Nailish continued, "I solved the problem of law. But I created the problem of heart." He gestured to the giant woman standing beside Ezekiel. "Ayanna is a warrior trained to fight and lead, but she is also a woman who chooses her own path. Apache law respects such choices." Ayanna stepped forward, her imposing height making even her father look small by comparison. "Chief," she said formally, "I choose to speak." "Speak then, daughter." Her deep voice carried across the yard with absolute clarity. "Brother has shown honor beyond any white man I have known. His heart is true, his courage proven." She paused, meeting Ezekiel's eyes directly. "My heart sees him not as brother, but as a man worthy of a different bond." Chief Nailish smiled, the same calculating expression that had terrified federal marshals. "Apache law has a solution for this too. A brother who proves himself worthy can be released from family bond by the chief's word, if the other family agrees." He turned to Idle. "Younger daughter, what say you?" Idle's massive frame straightened to its full impressive height. "I release Ezekiel Marsh from brotherhood. He has earned the right to choose his own path." She grinned, her smile transforming her imposing features. "And sister has waited long enough for happiness." "Then I speak the final decision," Chief Nailish announced, his voice echoing with authority. "I release Ezekiel Marsh from adoption. He is no longer my son by law." The words hung in the air like smoke. "But if he chooses, he can become my son by marriage, if my giant daughter agrees to have him." The ceremony that followed was unlike anything the frontier had ever seen. Apache traditions blended with territorial law, creating a marriage that was legal in both worlds. Federal authorities, still smarting from their earlier legal defeat, could only watch as Ezekiel married into one of the most powerful Apache families in the territory. Idle served as witness, her laughter ringing across the valley as she watched her sister's joy. Standing nearly 7 feet tall in traditional wedding dress, Ayanna was a sight that took every witness's breath away. A giant among women, beautiful and deadly, choosing love over duty. The trading post prospered beyond all expectations. The unusual sight of 2 giant Apache sisters working alongside their new brother-in-law became legend across the territory. Settlers came from hundreds of miles away just to see the women who stood taller than most men and could outwork any 3 ordinary people. Federal investigations ceased entirely when Washington realized the political value of a peaceful trading relationship. The small ranch that had once meant failure became the foundation of a new kind of frontier community where size meant respect and strength served peace. Chief Nailish's truly shocking decision had been revealed, not just adopting a white settler, but orchestrating an intricate legal chess game that freed his daughter to marry for love while maintaining tribal honor and federal protection. 6 months later, as Ezekiel watched his towering wife direct construction of their expanded home, he realized that some of life's greatest blessings come disguised as impossible complications. The giant Apache sisters had brought him not just love and prosperity, but a place in a world larger than any he had imagined possible. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where courage and destiny collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.